Speaker. As you know, about 2 years ago, the Pharmaceutical Outcomes Program was transitioned to form an institute called the Choice Institute. We are a global leader in generating knowledge to improve individual and population health through learning, research, and dissemination. We have the choice comes from this big title, which is a mouthful, so choice is much better in that way. We have three missions, obviously research, training, and service. In terms of research, we focus on health economics, outcomes research, pharmacoepidemiology, and healthcare policy analysis. In training, we do kind of work with the Department of Pharmacy PhD program and the PharmD Masters program, and kind of train them in the field of health economics and outcomes research. The Choice Institute is within the School of Pharmacy, but more specifically, it is within the Department of Pharmacy. So we have the opportunity to actually work closely with the clinical folks to really kind of focus on the pharmaceutical sector. And obviously, our service kind of spans globally around various countries and organizations. One of the things, so this is kind of the portfolio of our faculty, of our core faculty, including both the core Department of Pharmacy faculty and adjunct faculty, and spans expertise in all those areas that I talked about. And one of the key components of our institute is to promote diversity. We have a diversity statement. We kind of enforce that in every decision we make. We recently instituted an endowment to support diversity in our graduate education. So we hope to continue in this sphere as we go along. And then finally, I just wanted to give you a general portfolio. It's a small institute with about 9 core faculty, 11 core faculty, and 24 total faculty. We have about $5 million annual portfolio split evenly between research and teaching. And then this is our website, uwchoice.org. So if you know any prospective students applying to Choice, please mention that, and they can look for the details in the website. So with that, obviously we are very pleased and honored to have a preeminent health economist in the field to be our keynote speaker for this symposium. And I'd like to call in Lou Garrison to come and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, everyone. So it is a real honor and pleasure to have Professor Phelps here, Provost Emeritus from Rochester. Those of you who are in health economics will be familiar. I think we're on about the 5th edition of his textbook. We're using that in our class. I first met him in 1978 when I was a graduate student at NBR West. He came to a conference on supplier-induced demand. We're still arguing about whether you could ever identify supplier-induced demand. But he spoke there and went on to fame as working with Newhouse Phelps on the RAND health insurance experiment, one of the most influential things that have really been done in our field. There, after following really being one of the top 5 health economists in the field, he made this transition to the University of Rochester and eventually became the provost. So it was a big change to university administration. And if you talk to him, you'll realize he was very proud of what he accomplished at Rochester in terms of changing the direction of that school. Just as proud as the RAND health insurance experiment work that he's done. I had as part of ISPOR task force a couple of years ago, I was able to assemble a dream team, including Otterbahn and others, but Mark Hawley and Patricia Danza and Chuck, to think about value frameworks. And he's going to talk about some of the work that he's done related to that. So he was on my dream team. It was really great to see Phelps and Pauly and others. And then I do want to say something. The paper that he wrote in 1997 with Alan Garber, showing that you could derive cost-effectiveness thresholds from welfare economics theory, was very important in my thinking. I thought he'd kind of solved the problem, but he'll tell us, well, I did, but I've improved on that. So he's got something coming out pretty soon that's an improvement.
Just got the notes. July Value of Health.
July Value of Health. That moving that further, it's an important paper trying to set a threshold. So anyway, it's a real pleasure to have you, Professor Chuck, Professor Phelps, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say. He's talking about multi-criteria decision analysis. The task force, he'll talk about this. There are really 2 ways to go at getting at value, and he's going to talk about one of those. So thank you.
Well, thank you. We're going to have some handouts passed out to you. You'll come to later on in the session. I do have to start by those of you who are not economists, a bit of a story about economic wisdom and perspective. And the story relates to these two people who are up in a hot air balloon and a storm blows them away for 3 days. Finally, the storm clears and they vent some air out of the balloon, and they see somebody below them on the ground, and he yelled, "Where are we? You're in a balloon!" So one of the two turns to the other and says, "Can you imagine that? We've been blown around in a storm for 3 days, and the first person we find is an economist." And so the other guy says, "How do you know he's an economist?" And he says, "Well, think about it for a minute. What he told us was absolutely correct, and it was of no value whatsoever." So given that start, I'm launching into a new career kind of in multi-criteria decision analysis, which I hope what I do have to say today is of some value for you. It's a field of thinking that has roots in economics and operations research and systems engineering, so it's a very interdisciplinary activity. And I'm going to kind of give you a quick overview of what MCDA, multi-criteria decision analysis, means and does. And then at the end, handouts involve an exercise, if we have time to get to it, that I'll run you through on an important issue I think involves using multi-criteria decision analysis models in groups. So that is my plan. You'll have these set of slides, I think. Here's a set of sources of references that rely on a lot. You'll notice a lot of these involve a colleague named Guru Madhavan from the National Academy of Medicine. His name means exactly what it sounds like. A guru is a really smart guy. And most of what I say here today has been developed with Guru. All of the mistakes that I say are Guru's fault, and everything that's correct is mine. So I want to start out with a little history about evolving measures of value. Lou made reference to this. You started out with basically, in healthcare in particular, particularly the medical community, I think, basically said we don't want to do cost-benefit analysis because it requires putting a specific dollar value on lives, and we don't like to do that. And so there was a bunch of sort of baby steps that evolved to get around that problem. The first is people started measuring the health benefit of something in terms of what is fallaciously called lives saved. They're actually premature deaths postponed. The lives are never saved. Death rate is 1 per person. But that rapidly evolved into trying to do something to adjust for the duration of life that remained. And the first shot at that was, I saw, was called infant life equivalents. And that rapidly evolved by combining premature deaths with life tables, and you got life years saved. And then the refinement of adding quality adjustments to that, to the quality adjusted life years, or disability adjusted life years that the WHO uses, and very popular with people here in town at IHME. But if you're going to use these models about decision making that don't have cost benefit analysis, you need a decision rule. And so the decision rule in cost benefit analysis is monetize the benefits, and if the benefits exceed the costs, do it. And in cost benefit analysis, that's very simple if you accept the dollar value of monetization. Cost effectiveness analysis bypasses that. It takes the step of the monetary value out of the hands of the analyst and puts it into the hands of the decision maker. So you have to choose a cutoff that says, how much am I willing to pay for a quality adjusted life year gain in health? And so that willingness to pay is the key issue in many ways in actually using cost effectiveness analysis. As Lou had mentioned, Alan Garber and I proved in 1997 for the first time it was actually a legitimate operation. But it's for a single person's utility. That was the model, is a single utility maximizing rational individual, and it can't incorporate a whole lot of things that cross boundaries involve multiple people. The most obvious thing that's widely cited are equity concerns, the distribution of the costs and the benefits, and in fact, cost-benefit analysis is completely agnostic about who bears the costs and gets the benefits. So that problem about distribution is one of the many things that cost effectiveness cannot handle. And in fact, the journal Cost Effectiveness and Resource Allocation has this quote from the editors that says, recognize that the model alone may not provide sufficient information for decision makers to guide their choices. That's in their editorial statement for the journal. for the journal that studies cost-effectiveness analysis in its title. So then there have been efforts to expand beyond the original measure of health benefit inequalities and the cost. The first of these was an expanded cost-effectiveness analysis. It starts to capture information not only about costs and qualities, but also about financial risk that each of these outcomes imposes, and it collects this information in population subgroups that seem relevant to decision makers, and then you can calculate the ratio of these to cost, the qualities, or financial risk, but you can't combine them anyways. That's the real problem. You can't summarize this into a single index. Expanding beyond that, the task force that Lou and I and Anirban were on for the ISPOR produced a series of, I think it's 7 articles and published in the Value in Health in February of 2018. And that, there's one of the articles, I think this is the one that was Darius Lockdewall was the head on, produced a shopping list of about a dozen things you might add to the qualities in there. Instead, in fact, the report said you have to include qualities, and it probably should be a large chunk of the total picture, but it says here are all these other things. I added antibiotic resistance to the list that the task force produced, but you've got this big shopping list of what I will call attributes of medical interventions, and the only one that cost effectiveness analysis captures is the qualities. So the question is, how do you grab the rest of the stuff and incorporate it into a decision model? And again, this augmented cost effectiveness, there's no single metric. You can't choose a winner unless there's a dominant strategy. Now, in this world, just as in cost effectiveness analysis, a dominant strategy in cost effectiveness says healthcare improves and costs fall. That's a dominant strategy. And a dominated strategy is costs go up and healthcare benefits go down. That's dominated. And in between, when it's costs and qualities both go up or both go down, then you have to use these ratios to find out what's the cost effectiveness ratio, and that's the decision point. And the more things you stick into the model, the harder it is to find a dominant strategy, because instead of just finding 2 levels of dominance, you got to find 5 or 6 or 10 dominance points, and that's increasingly important. So basically what you want to try and find is a way to summarize all of these different dimensions of value into a single metric. And in the economics world, it's called a utility function. And we say people get utility from some combination of things they're consuming, and that's the total utility. And the question is, how much do each of these count in the utility? What are the weights in simplest terms? And multi-criteria decision analysis attempts to approximate that. Now, some MCDA models actually disclaim that they're using economic utility structures, but they all come out pretty much with the same idea, as I'll show you. So I'm happy to talk about them in my own context as saying these are approximations to an economist utility function. So the benefits of MCDA, I catalog a handful of them that I think are important to understand why we might want to do this. Most importantly, it allows you to actually do multidimensional value comparisons because you summarize things into a single score. The value weights, what's important and how much importance to attach to them is determined by each user. So the decision maker determines the value. And if that's a group decision, like the decision of a CDC committee about the value of a new vaccine, there's a bunch of people voting on that, and that complicates the world a lot. That's what the exercise later on this afternoon is about, is how to do this in groups. Okay? But each metric is specific, so they have this characteristic that's kind of like if you're saying how warm is it outside, and some people are talking in Fahrenheit and some people are talking in centigrade. And unless you know what the scale is, it's hard to interpret whether I really like 30. Okay? I don't know what that means unless I know what the scale is. So that's a problem. But it also allows incremental benefit cost ratios, just like cost effectiveness does, only you're summarizing the scores of a bunch of different dimensions into the value metric instead of just saying the value comes only from qualities. And I think that's important, and that means you can use it in decision-making structures just as you can use cost-effectiveness analysis. And I think also very important in this, it makes the assumptions about what's valuable obvious and transparent. Now, every cost-effectiveness study that's published either has or should include a statement that says, this is the cost-effectiveness story, but real decisions require decision makers to consider other things. And what happens is they get the cost-effectiveness study, and then they go into the back room and they come out and say, this is what we're going to do because of these other considerations, and you never know how they use those other considerations. The formal model of multi-criteria MCDA makes it very obvious how they're doing it. So that's, I think, one of the primary benefits is transparency, which I think is becoming increasingly valuable in our world. So this is a systems approach. It brings this sort of system analysis. It's user-friendly, it's transparent. It also focuses data collection. So if you start doing an MCDA model, you can actually do some sensitivity analysis and find out which things are swinging the decision. And those are the ones where you want to improve the data. So if you have limited resources to improve the data quality, it can tell you where to spend your effort. And typically it's the ones with the highest weights in the model, but it does that. It also avoids human cognitive errors. Now there's a long list of these that have been compiled by the people in what's now called the behavioral economics world. The most recent recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, Richard Thaler, is a practitioner of this behavioral economics world, and it points out all sorts of things where real humans make a lot of errors when they're making judgments. They misestimate probabilities and they use them incorrectly compared to a rational decision-making model. I have to say, with some note of pride, Richard Thaler got his PhD at the University of Rochester Department of Economics. He left just before I arrived, so I can't take any credit for his Nobel Prize in Economics. You can also use these models in reverse engineering, so you can fiddle around with the choices that you have. You can tweak the parameters a little and see if that increases or decreases the value, and if it increases the value, you can find out if it's worth the extra cost to make that tweak. So it's kind of like a flight simulator. You can fly before you buy. So there's that value. You can use it in resource allocations, and in some cases, if you have competing parties that actually disagree about what the right choice is, these structured models can sometimes, not always, but can sometimes help create convergence on decision processes. So those, I would argue, are some of the real benefits of MCDA. And everybody gets to play at some stage. You can use a societal perspective, in which case you want some sort of a representative body setting the weights. It might be our elected legislators. It might be a panel of experts that's been appointed. It might be a public vote in some sense. That's been done in a couple of cases on things I could recommend. You could bring that down from the entire society, like the British National Health Service, and bring it into a single health plan, like Kaiser Permanente. And they could use this model to make decisions of what is offered, what treatments are offered to enrollees in Kaiser Permanente, a subset of the societal decision with a similar group process, or a provider like a hospital or healthcare system could decide what they'd like to, what new technology they might wish or not wish to add. They could use this approach to do that. You could have corporations like pharmaceutical companies using it to help decide what drugs they want to produce or vaccines they want to produce. And you can have individual patients use this to decide among treatment choices. In fact, I was just talking within an hour ago with a couple of your colleagues here at the University of Washington who are embarked on a study to bring this idea of using MCDA to help people choose among therapeutic options that has, I think, some really exciting potential. In concept, they all use the same general idea, use the same general structure. They'll choose different things that are important and they'll put different weights on them as you move down these layers. So individual patients presumably won't care very much about total costs of care. They might care a lot about out-of-pocket costs, but they may care a lot about the different side effects of a cancer therapy, whereas that might become less important in the global decision about whether or not to provide it. So the core ideas of MCDA, they're a little different than what economists traditionally do. Economists typically will get a bunch of data on what people actually did, observed choices that people made, and they'll go out and they'll estimate a bunch of demand equations, for example, that try and infer people's preferences from the actual behavior. MCDA does not do that. Instead, it elicits the preferences from decision makers. You ask a bunch of questions of the decision makers to try and get them to reveal how much importance they place on various things, and then you use those to weight the preference function. And so the first thing you do is determine what's on the list, what's important. And then the second thing is you elicit the preference weights, and there's 24 different MCDA models I've seen. Mostly they differ on the question, how do you go about eliciting the preferences from the decision makers? And then you measure the performance of every option or choice you have on each dimension of value, and that's a complicated process. One of the complaints about this process is it adds a lot of work. Okay, and the primary work is if you have 6 dimensions of value instead of just qualities, you've got to measure how much each choice performs on each of those dimensions of value, on equity, on avoidance of financial risk, on avoidance of concern about contagion. You have to score every choice on every component of value, and then you combine them eventually into a weighted sum of performances. Almost all of them eventually come down to this very simple weighting function. They say it's a linear weighted sum of the performances of each of the candidates. So that is, although there are variants on that, in fact, this is the basic idea. The value, call it utility here, the weights apply to each of the attributes, and then you score each choice on how well it performs on each attribute. You add them up with the weights, and that gives you a value score, and then you compare the total values. That is MCDA in a nutshell, and they all differ on how you get the weights. That's the primary difference between these approaches. Here's a list of some of them that are fairly common in the literature. Multi-attribute utility theory. I got quite familiar with that with a 3-year project I did for the Institute of Medicine on setting priorities for vaccines. You can play with that model online. Google Smart Vaccines and Institute of Medicine. You can go to a page where you can download the software and you can play with a very elaborate model to prioritize vaccines. It's a multi-attribute utility theory model. Analytic hierarchy process has been used more widely in healthcare. None of these have been used widely in healthcare, I'll just say right now. Have been very limited use in healthcare, more widely in other areas of society. And then a bunch of them, they're named after heroic mythic figures, Macbeth, Prometheus. There's just a whole string of heroic figures on these. I've played around a little with Macbeth, and I've seen Paprika, but I've not used it. But there are just dozens of these to play around with, and I'll talk a little about which are easier and harder to use, and why I think you should move your attention to the ones that are easier to use, in a particular multi-attribute utility theory. So this is the easiest of these to explain and use, and I'm going to spend the rest of my time today talking about MAUT. Remember, it's only one of a number of ways to do MCDA, to run a bunch of alphabet soup at you. So multi-attribute utility theory has its origins in some work by a decision theorist, Ralph Keeney, and he specifies a bunch of conditions about this, of preferentially independent and utility independent. I'm not going to try and go into the technicality of that today, that's not my task, but if these conditions are fulfilled, Keeney proved that all utility functions are in one of 2 forms. They're either this linear weighted sum, which I showed you earlier, or they're a multiplicative version of that. And where the weights are all between 0 and 1, and the totals, they add up to 1, and the sum of the scores then adds up to 0 and 1 when you finally get down to it. So the scores are between 0 and 1, or between 0 and 100. So the multi-attribute utility model produces a score between a 0 and 100 is the typical goal. And this complicated product form, I've actually proved, I won't bother with the proof of it today, I proved that if you take the log of that, the linear form is the first order Taylor series expansion of the log of that one. So if you do this, you're getting at least the first order version of that. So almost everybody actually ends up using this linear form at the top, on the top line of this, and that's where we're going to be concentrating our attention. In the MAUT model, you need to do, this is one of the little tricks of the trade, you need to describe in this what's the best possible outcome on each attribute and what's the worst. Those define the yardstick for measuring performance. So think about it, in the world of sports, for example, a decathlon is a 10-event sporting event in the Olympics. And so you run 100 meters, you run 1,600 meters, you throw a javelin, you jump over, you pole vault, you jump over a stick and see how high you can jump. How do you add up the performances of all those things to get a winner in the decathlon? And the answer is they put some boundaries on what's considered a really good and a really bad performance, and then scale each participant's performance proportional to that. So the world record is the best you can do, and that gets you the top score. If you get a world record on every one of these 10 events, you get 1,200 points in the decathlon. And if you do worse than a certain value, you get a 0, and in between it's a proportional score on how we've done, and they just add them up kind of with linear weights. But this measuring stick is important, and it's hard to do right. So getting this measuring stick right, I'll show you an example of that in just a few minutes with a little toy version of this. But this measuring stick is important. And every attribute, then you get the measuring stick, which is the best minus the worst, and then you score each attribute is how well they're doing relative to the worst divided by the length of the measuring stick. So that's the way you normalize everything, and then you can add them up with weights on them. Okay? That's a more difficult process to do than you might think. So here's an example. We're going to choose the next car for our family. By the way, I programmed this in Excel in about half an hour. It's not complicated math. So the 4 cars we're going to look at for our family are a Maserati or Bugatti, a Chrysler Caravan, a Ford something or other, a very small low-cost car, and a Toyota Prius, and of course they vary hugely in their performance characteristics. So here are the raw scores of the Bugatti, the Chevy Spark, the Town & Country, and the Prius. You see these. The Bugatti on miles per gallon is awful. It's 10.4 miles per gallon. And that's probably if you're not a heavy lead foot. The Town & Country gets 22, the Spark gets 38 miles per gallon, and the Prius gets 50. Those are the raw scores. And then you have the same thing on their acceleration time. How long does it take to get to 60 miles an hour? The Bugatti is a hands-down winner. Here, less is better. So you have to reverse the scale, but the Bugatti does that in 2.4 seconds, and the Prius and the Spark do that in over 10 seconds, and also the number of seats they have in them. And so which car you want, obviously, is going to depend on how important each of these 4 dimensions of value are, right? And so we're going to set up a little dummy model and do that. Those are the raw scores, and now we need to normalize them. So here's how the normalization works. You start out, we'll give an example, the miles per gallon, the best is 50 miles per gallon, and we're just going to say the worst you could do is 10. So the difference, the swing weight is 40, and 40 becomes the yardstick for miles per gallon. You got it? And so 50, 10, and 40 is your swing weight, and then the same thing is going to happen with acceleration. There's a swing of 10 and how fast you can get to 60 miles an hour, and there's a swing of 6 seats. So 40, 10, and 6 become the measuring sticks for these 3 attributes. And now, here are the scores that you get for the Bugatti. Let's take the Spark as an example, the 38 miles per gallon. Okay, it's 10 is the base, 38 is the score. So 38 is 28 better than the worst. And then that 28 is divided by 40, it's 70% of 40. So the Spark gets a score of 70 in mileage. See how it works? It's actually pretty simple. And then you have to do that again for everybody else, and that fills out the whole table. And now we'll put the weights in. So I arbitrarily said this person, this consumer or this family says 60% of their weight is on miles per gallon, 30% is on acceleration, and 10% is on the number of seats. Well, we kind of know who's going to win, right? Well, the Bugatti's going to lose because it stinks on miles per gallon, which is the most important weight. So Bugatti's score is 0.6 times 1, the worst score you can get. It gets 96 out of 100 on the possible acceleration, but that only counts for 30%. And it's the worst possible in seats, which it's only 2, it gets 10%. So the Bugatti's total weighted score is 29.4. Probably a little too much precision, but 29.4 is the number that comes out of the machinery. And you can do the same thing again for the Toyota Prius. It gets a top score on miles per gallon with 60% weight. It gets a decent score on a low score on acceleration, and it gets a pretty good score on the number of seats. And so its overall score is 70.7. And if you do the same exercise for the other 2 cars, you'll see with these weights, the best car is a Prius. Now this is a real simple-minded thing. You probably could infer the Prius is best for a family without doing this, but it gives you at least a sense of how the model works. Some of the scores are being subjective, yet as you can't get a numerical score of miles per gallon. And in the world of healthcare, equity is obviously going to be a subjective. How well does this improve equity in our society? How well does it fit in the local healthcare system or the cultural values of the patient population? What's the probability that it'll create a scientific breakthrough that can be used in other inventions? It will be ultimately a subjective estimate. Fear of contagion is going to be a subjective measure about how much that. Ebola is going to score real high on fear of contagion. Another vaccine choice is tetanus. There's 0 fear of contagion. It's not transmitted by contagious processes. In the history of humanity, this fear of contagion has dominated public policy in a number of cases. I can name, going back to biblical times, leprosy. And in more recent times, my father was hospitalized for a year with tuberculosis because they wanted him out of circulation. And more recently, polio when I was growing up young. A few people in the room here are old enough to remember the polio epidemic and the scares that created. And more recently, HIV, Ebola, and most recently, Zika. The fear of contagion dominates public policy. It's not in cost-effectiveness models, folks. So that's something we want to try and figure out a way. And abhorrent diseases is dying of cancer worse than dying of some other disease. So these are all things that you could try and bring into a model. Now, having said all that and all the nice things about MCDA, let me tell you the complaints that I've heard about it as I talk about it around the country and around the world. I've given maybe 40 or 50 presentations of smart vaccines, this model on vaccine priorities, and this summarizes the complaints I've heard about them. It requires too much data. I'm going to go through these in order in a moment. You can play games with the system by changing the weights to get any outcome you want. I don't know what the score means. It's useless with budget constraints. You can't bother using it. Wouldn't it be simpler just to monetize all this stuff and stuff them into the quality measure? And the models are unwieldy, perhaps intractably so, in collective decision in groups. So I'm going to wander through those 6 concerns. First complaint, demands too much data. Yes, MCDA demands more data than cost-effectiveness analysis. No, it's not the cause of the model, it's the nature of the problem. Okay? The problems are complex. The model helps organize the data. And if you're not actually thinking about these data, you're not thinking about the problem carefully. So my argument is the problem actually helps illuminate the nature and assemble the data that are relevant and makes it easier to do, not harder. And if you're ignoring these other dimensions because you don't want to bother getting the data, you're just simply making a mistake. So that's my summary of that complaint. It's too easy to game the system and get any answer you want. I've heard this concern over and over again. And the first answer, yes, you can get almost any answer you want by changing the weights. If you want to buy a Bugatti, put 90% weight on acceleration. If you go back to my automobile model, it'll spit out Bugatti as the winner if you put 90% of the weight on acceleration. If you want to be sure you buy a Prius, you put 90% of the weight on the Prius. So you can game the system that way, no question. But the benefit of transparency to me overrides this because you've written down what your weights are. They're publicly visible. So you can't really hide what you're doing in this world because you've written down the answers. It's in print. And that's unlike what happens when people say, this was the cost-effectiveness score, but we decided to do this other thing because of these other considerations. That's gaming the system, folks. That's not transparent. So I think actually the gaming the system article is misplaced as well. The third one is I don't know what the index means. And this is actually a more complicated problem because remember, your index and mine differ if we have different weights. And particularly obscure because in their raw form, these are not relative scales where 20 is twice as good as 10. These are like temperature scales, like Fahrenheit and centigrade. So we all know intuitively that 40 degrees Fahrenheit is not twice as warm as 20 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And we know that's also true if I'm saying 40 degrees centigrade and 20 degrees centigrade, but they mean different things. There's a difference of 20 in those numbers, but they mean different things. And the straight multi-attribute utility index scores are not they're interval scores and not ratios. So you have to have a natural zero to be able to do ratios. If you have a natural zero in a score, then 20 is twice as good as 10. How do we get to that? Well, first answer is you can do exactly what we do in cost effectiveness analysis. Do incremental ratios. So we take the incremental benefit, how much extra benefit do we add by doing this treatment over the alternative, and how much extra cost. The differences have a natural zero. As zero is a natural, no difference is a natural zero. So when you do incremental use of this model, you get a ratio index, and 20 is twice as good as 10. And there are actually some of the models that produce a ratio score, and that solves the problem intrinsically. Analytic hierarchy process does that, for example, although it has other concerns. So there are ways around that, and people will get used to in a hurry what the index means. The fourth is you can't use it with a budget constraint. We've figured out how to use cost effectiveness with a budget constraint. We take cost effectiveness ratios and we have a cutoff score, and it says if this is more costly for quality than our cutoff score, we won't do it, and vice versa. You can do exactly the same thing with multi-attribute theory. I'll show you some more examples a little bit later on. Why not just monetize everything and stuff it into the qualities or into the cost measure? The answer is you can't do that with some of the attributes. You just have no simple way to monetize them. So you do an approximation in MCDA. And number 6, the complaint is these are incredibly unwieldy, particularly in group decision making, because you've got groups trying to make decisions and they have to modify them. And my response to this, yes, this is a real concern, and we have to find ways to make these models simpler to use, particularly in group decision making settings. And that is in some sense the focus of the research that I'm now doing in MCDA, is how to make these transparent, readily accessible and easy to understand and easy to use, and particularly easy to use when groups like this group of people in this room making decisions. You'll have a little exercise in that decision-making process by the end of the afternoon to show you, illuminate what I mean by these things. So those are I think the 6 major concerns I've had about these models. And I think they're all, we can deal with all of them, but they all take more work, and particularly trying to find out which one of these is easiest to use and most obviously, intuitively obvious about what they mean to users. They do make demands on decision makers, and if they're K attributes is the list of how many things on your list of what matters. You got to have a weight on each one of them. It's just K things, you got to have K weights. And then if you have N candidates you're choosing among, then you've got to have each of those N candidates has to be scored on each of the K attributes. This can add up in a big hurry, folks. So you want to have parsimonious choice of how many attributes you have. And you may want to have some way of weeding out candidates that are obviously not going to make the cut. The least demanding of these, of any that I've encountered, is multi-attribute utility theory, and the most demanding by far is the analytic hierarchy process. MAUT, at the simplest form of it, if you have K attributes, you need K minus 1 decisions for the decision maker to get the weights. You can double that under another method, but it's an order of K. 2 times K or 1 times K in round numbers with these various choices. And that's pretty simple. It's as simple as you get. And then on each of the candidates, these N candidates you have, each of them has to be scored on K dimensions of value. So basically an N times K choices you have to make about the scores of the candidates on the decisions. And that gives you a total of about k times n in round numbers. It's a little less than that. That gives the upper bound on the number of decisions the decision maker has to make. When you turn to the analytic hierarchy process, the number of decisions goes up by at least a factor of n compared to that. So if you have 10 candidates, you have 10 times as many decisions they have to make. That's not a good thing if you have a group trying to make a decision. It's too many votes. They won't do it. So I've been focusing on this question about usability in groups as a real issue. The data demands, yeah, they do require more decisions. Good staff work can handle a lot of these, and choosing the least complex models help. And I've said several times you'll have a group exercise in some of this in a bit. How much of it can be quantified? Go back to that list that I put up at the beginning from the ISPOR task force. I've been working with Darius Lakdawala at University of Southern California. We now have, I think, a very solid model about a way to monetize the value of hope and the value of insurance. I talked about that yesterday at the Hutch. A few of you were there at that, and I hope we'll have that out in print in a few months so you can see what's going on. It's a fairly complicated math model, and I don't want to dive it in. I think we can probably find some ways to monetize real option value. Real option value says, keep me alive for a year because there's some probability that something will come along that will save my life in that year interval. How much is that option worth? That's real option value, and I think there are ways to do that. Something I think is pretty easy to build into standard models of cost effectiveness now is things that improve adherence to treatment regimens, particularly in chronic illnesses. That's really important, and you can just build that into a decision tree. So I think that's almost trivially simple to do conceptually. It's a lot of complexity about modeling the adherence and how different things change it, but it's conceptually not hard. So some of these can be quantified. I mentioned the thing that Darius and I were doing. There's the formula for it. Basically, what you need to do this is to not only measure the average improvement from medical treatment compared to the current strategy, but you need to measure the variance and the skewness of the distributions of the outcomes. And in fact, the skewness, right skewness is a really good thing. You get more probability sitting on the best outcomes. It really improves the value of the treatment. So just a little precursor of that. I don't want to bother with that now. Real option value. Here's a simple example of how I think about it. And you've thought about this some, haven't you, Anirban, and option value?
Yeah, we have a paper coming out with one of our students who graduated last
so
year.
Here's a kind of a simple thing about what I mean by option value. To extend your life for a year, supposing there's some probability the new cure may come along that'll extend my life by 10 years. So we have to make a subjective judgment about what that probability is. That's not verifiable scientific fact. So you're going to have a subjective probability assigned to that. And then the real option value, if it's 0.01 that's going to emerge in the 10 years and it gains 10 years of qualities, then the real option value is 0.1 qualities, and if a quality is worth $100,000, that option is $10,000. That's
the one thing that's missing here is that there's a cost associated with that new technology which may be different.
right.
So you have to account.
Yeah,
for
you're
that
right.
too.
This is the value of it, but obviously
Yeah.
the cost of producing it
Right,
has
yeah.
to be built
Yeah.
into the decision also. But if the problem with this is the probability that 1% that it's going to emerge during that 1 year window is not knowable from facts, really. And you really have to use the ex-ante probabilities to do that. So that's just kind of, there are some alternatives to the MCDA, but now let's come into the question, who might use MCDA and how? Individuals might use it to choose a health plan by rating the characteristics of different choices in health plans. The average individual choosing a plan in Medicare Advantage, the Part C of Medicare, on average U.S. citizens have 24 different plans to choose from. So in concept, you could organize an MCDA model and help people choose among those. How well do they protect against risk? How do they cover the drugs that I'm taking, and so on and so on. You could use it for choosing a primary care provider. What are the attributes? Is it a woman? Is it trained at a hotshot medical school, et cetera? So you could think about different attributes that might enter that. and alternative therapies for a specific disease. And I mentioned earlier, you have some colleagues here that are working on one about whether you should get a low or a high transplant if you're in need of a leg amputation. And I think that could be really exciting work in that whole general area, or choose among chemotherapy regimens that have different alternative risks of treatment benefits and risks of side effects. So that's where you could use that at the individual level. The health plans, I'd make, could choose it to decide what benefits to offer or what drugs to put on which tier. Pharmaceutical manufacturers could use it for reverse engineering to say which of several choices do we want to bring to market, which are most viable, from sort of get a synthetic patient population and try and figure out which is most viable, and then compare that against the cost of bringing the different drugs to markets. And a British National Health Service could use this instead of using simply cost-effectiveness analysis. So this layers all the way up and down the societal structure. I mentioned these individual levels, and in addition to the ones I mentioned, you could choose in nursing homes. One that's just been sent off to press, my colleague Laura Panantoni and Scott Ramsey and some people from others. Laura, wave your hand, take a bow. We've actually tested the ability of individual patients to do this in a real patient setting. And this is the scores here of their MCDA scores on various things. They are quite strongly predictive of whether they actually end up getting chemotherapy or not. To me, that's not the most exciting part about this. It was sort of, oh yeah, of course they can, given the way this was structured. The real exciting thing, you can actually administer this in a clinical setting. And you can take it into a patient setting, and patients can do this. So we have an existence proof in some sense that you can actually use this kind of a tool in a real patient population. You could think about extra dimensions of value in various settings. In Canada, when we presented this, citizens of their northern territories are very important as the Eskimo population, Inuit populations basically. They're particularly important to improve the health to the Canadian Ministry of Health, and so they want to find things that add value to that. It's an equity dimension that they can nail down. We want to do that. They want to put that into the model when they start deciding what to do. And again, private health plans or individuals could do all sorts of things on that. Manufacturers might use this as a proxy client, I'd mentioned, understanding the value structure of the proxy client or the reverse engineering. They could fiddle around with it to do pricing decisions, particularly if the payers start to use MCDA, then the pharmacy people would want to know what those models look like also. So that would be another use of this. And you can use it with budgets. This has been one of the major complaints against the model for a long time. It was originally true there was no way to use it with budgets, and now there are 3 ways. I'll run through them very briefly. The first was produced by Larry Phelps, a British guy who's a big fan and user of MCDA and has a consulting business that thrives using it. And basically what you do in this model, each one of these dots along this curve is a different intervention or different investment decision you could make. And you rate them all using the same MCDA score and then divide them by the cost of implementing them. And the ones that are best you do first. They've got the greatest benefit to cost ratio, and you eventually run up until you run out of budget and you stop. That's Larry Phelps' tool. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell you how to set the budget. The budget is exogenous in his world, and in fact, somebody has to set the budget. So you want to turn to other choices. So one model that I've devised and published in an article a couple of years ago with Guru, my colleague from the academies, is you think about the simplest of all simple multi-attribute forms. I have 2 things in my attribute form. I have qualities that get a weight of W, and everything else in the model gets a weight of 1 minus W. Okay? Now, if I know how much I want to pay for a quality, I can extrapolate that, and I get the multi-attribute utility theory, MAUI. And I'll give you the palm trees to remind you what the MAUI is. But you can then extrapolate from how much you're willing to pay for a quality to how much you're willing to pay for a MAUI by knowing how much the total score is qualities. And that's pretty simple unless the weight on qualities is small and then errors begin to compound in error. Here's a kind of a simple example. I have the decision maker at the top level. has 50-50 weights on qualities and everything else. Cost per quality is cut off as 80,000 per quality. That decision would say I'll pay 160,000 for a Maui score. And the other one, the next one, has a 2/3, 1/3, and 100,000, and willing to pay for a quality, and they end up with 150. They're similar just by coincidence, but you can extrapolate. If you agree on the willingness to pay for a quality, you can build up to a willingness to pay for a Maui as well, as long as you've got qualities in the Maui score. And you should always have, in healthcare, you should have qualities in the Maui score, and you should have a big weight on it. I think everybody thinks that's probably correct. What is the cutoff? If you're going to use cost effectiveness models and make real decisions, you need a cutoff, the maximum willingness to pay for a quality. And the same is true if you're going to use this extrapolation method, because you've got to start with a willingness to pay for a quality. So how do we decide how much we're willing to pay for a quality? This is a big and complicated literature, and there's no general agreement on the answer. So the first uses of these basically said, let's look around at other healthcare interventions and see how much they cost per quality, and we'll try and figure out what's reasonable on that list, and we'll say that's our cutoff. Those are called league tables. The real problem is you don't know whether there was any cost effectiveness criterion involved in the original put them into use. And you have no way of knowing, except arbitrarily, what's really determined as being reasonable. So that's a problem. Another approach to this is to use wage premiums and risky occupations. So you look at how much extra firemen and policemen get for undertaking their risky jobs and the risk they have in those jobs, and you can back calculate the value of statistical life, and then you spread that out over a number of years. You can figure out the value of a 1 year of a quality from that. That's one approach to that. Some people just announce them. WHO has announced a value of 1 to 3 times per capita GDP. I've got a new paper that's coming out in the July issue of Value in Health that has a new method of doing that. It says for a person with median income, average income about $50,000, about $100,000 is about the right quality. But there's no pure agreement. That's the new paper coming out. And then you have the problem, what if the budget won't support all of these interventions that you want to do? This is the affordability question. It's coming home to roost in a lot of ways in cost effectiveness. You've got this whole list of things that are cost effective. By your rule, you add up the cost of doing them when your budget won't afford them. So ultimately you have to bring the two into alignment. That's a problem with cost effectiveness. The same problem is true in trying to do this in MCDA. And of course, the real elephant in the room is that once you add all these other dimensions of value, like equity or scientific spillovers, who's going to pay for them? Do you want your health plan to pay for scientific spillovers or equity? Probably not in their mission statement. So this is a real issue, is trying to find out coalitions of who's going to add money to the pot to pay for these. That's the big elephant in the room. So, summary of these for measuring the values, they provide a way to integrate multiple dimensions of value. They do require more data than cost effectiveness analysis. Every user gets their own statement of value, which is either good or bad depending on your viewpoint. They increase transparency. You can use them just like cost effectiveness in budget settings as long as you agree about how much you're willing to pay for cost per quality. But you have to have that cutoff in order to use them in budget settings in either cost effectiveness or using MCDA. It's not a works in one and not the other. The same problem exists in both of these. So how do we get from where we are to getting to where we could use MCDA regularly? And I will just tell you, we're a long way from that in the United States and probably in the rest of the world. Probably some of the doctoral students I was meeting with over lunch asked this. I think probably you're going to see this approach coming into European settings sooner than in the US because they've used MCDA more in other types of decisions. And they're beginning to actually score health interventions on multi-attribute values and figure out how to use them. So I think you're going to see these in Europe and France and the Netherlands and so on sooner than you see them in the UK or the United States. But eventually, I think these are going to come around and start seeing more use. And so this is sort of asking, what do we need to do to help move that along? Because I'd actually like to see it moved along, not because I'm sure that it's the right thing to do, but rather because we won't know if it's actually helping decisions until we do a bunch of them and compare to how we're making decisions now. So we have to actually put it in practice to find out if it's valuable. So it's actually just like a medical treatment. You can't find out if a treatment works until you actually use it on some patients. The same is true of this in decision making. You gotta use it to find out if it works. So we need to obviously build out the databases so we're measuring these multiple attributes on different things. This augmented cost effectiveness models that the ISPOR task force identified is a good start. It's going to start measuring these attributes on different things, and it'll build up the data so you can use them in MCDA. That's a good start. We have to really figure out how to simplify these models so that people understand how to use them. If it's individual patients trying to choose their chemotherapy or which amputation choice to make, you have to make this model comprehensible and easy to use for them. And when you get into a group setting, you have to also have a voting rule that it works and it's easy to understand. And we've got to test drive it in a bunch of settings. I think that's, until we do a bunch of test drives and compare them head to head, this is going to be a fruitless endeavor. And ultimately, I think it will help if people begin to develop a kind of a core set of attributes you should think about. You know, if you're thinking about things to add to cost effectiveness analysis for the British National Health Service, there's actually probably 2 or 3 or 4 things that are most important for the British Parliament to think about as they're doing that. And so if we could get some consensus on that core set of attributes and the weights to put on them, it will help move these along. And now the onus on you here at the University of Washington. Very few people know how to use these models. Schools of public health, business schools, schools of public policy, schools of pharmacy are training people in using decision theory. They're training people on how to do cost effectiveness analysis. Please start putting some MCDA courses on your curricula too. Because until we have people that know how to do it that can go out there in the real world, it won't get done. So it's your job to help me, folks. All right? In professional schools is almost certainly where this is going to happen. Yes?
Do you know of a good paper that evaluates the, like the conventional, like HTA process, that they go back in the back room with a bunch of evidence and makes the decisions compared to a good MCDA?
Yeah, so the question is, do we know how real world health technology assessment people do this? And has it ever been compared to MCDA? And the answer is no and no. People never tell you what they did in the back room. That's why they do it in the back room instead of in public, okay? And nobody is using MCDA to make a formal comparison yet. So the answer, but mostly they never tell you how they did it. It's all in the sausage machine and you don't want to look, okay? Okay, so that's, yeah.
So I'm a little confused about why the threshold should increase when we go from a quality to a MOT. Wasn't the threshold can go in either direction? Because we are using a weighted average and not an arithmetic average.
Okay. The intuitive, Annabon's question, just to repeat it, is why do you want to expand the willingness to pay? And the answer is because you've got more value measured there.
But it's still a weighted average. It's not.
It is, but you're right. So you may want to expand it, but if you agree that you're willing to pay for a quality, if you're willing to pay $100,000 for a quality and it's only 2/3 of the weight, then obviously the package that includes that chunk of qualities and something else should be more valuable. Now the problem comes in the budget constraint. It's not a perfect extrapolation. And so you can't extrapolate linearly forever.
I mean, I was thinking if you had to evaluate a proposal, right, and get an incremental cost effectiveness ratio, and then you find an incremental benefit cost ratio based on this, that could go in either direction, right? Using this, so it could go down or it could go up.
Yeah, I think in general, if you're adding more value to the package, you want to pay more for it. But you can't just linearly extrapolate forever because you run into budget constraints and diminishing returns.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have an argument about that later. But the answer is that hasn't been worked out yet, even in the affordability question with cost effectiveness, let alone in this broader set. And it certainly hasn't been worked out who's going to pay for these extra benefits.
Right.
If the question is strictly within the British National Health Service, they don't have extra money to pay for these benefits. So it's probably fruitless for them to add these extra things into the measure unless they've got money to pay for them from the whatever the finance ministry is going to dole out to them. So this really interacts heavily with the affordability question. Okay. So we're going to shift gears a little now and come into a question which I think is fundamental to doing this MCDA stuff into the future, and that's how do you make decisions in a group? Now, I ran into this problem like walking into a glass door that I hadn't seen when my colleagues and I from the Institute of Medicine first took smart vaccines on the road and test drove it in a bunch of real life settings. The Canadian Ministry of Health, the New York State Ministry of Health, a pharmaceutical company in India, and we said, here's this, the first of these was up at the Canadian Ministry of Health. We said, here's this really cool model to help prioritize which vaccines you might want to use in Canada. And they were excited beyond comparison about this. They just almost wet their pants, they were so excited. And we got up there and we gave this seminar and everything was just great. They were just cheering and cheering and cheering. And then afterwards, the head of their ministry, their equivalent of the head of their CDC, came up to me and said, Chuck, how do we use this when a group is making the decision about the weights? And I said, I have not the foggiest idea. Because all of these models about decision making presume an individual decision maker. Now, when Beth and her colleagues are doing this thing about which amputation choice do you want, that's not a voting model. That's one person making that choice. You don't need to worry about that as a single decision maker. But when you have a group making the decision, you need a voting model to assemble the preferences of that group into a single choice. That's social choice theory, and I'll tell you folks, it is a very weird set of theories, and it gives you no guidance whatsoever about choosing a voting model. The social choice theory, I'll tell you right now, is absolutely useless in trying to recommend which voting model to use. So that embarked on what Guru and I are now doing, is testing out different voting models to see how easy they are to use. We're trying to figure out the human factors. Can you use them? Are they easy to use? Or are they too complicated? Do you understand how they work? Do they give you a way to express your opinion that's satisfying to you? These are the sorts of things. So that's what the handouts are for, okay? So now get your handouts and a pen or a pencil in hand. What I want you to do, we're going to give you 6 different voting methods. We're going to give you 6 different ballots you're going to play with, and then I'll explain these to you each as we get to them. And I'm going to ask you to do the same task on each of these 6 different ballots. Okay? Then I'm going to ask you to tell me what you thought about these different ballots and different voting rules. There's an implied consent here. If you turn back your data forms to me, I'm going to do a little research with them and publish them anonymously. So if you give me your answers back, there's an implied consent here. That's probably illegal under University of Washington IRB rules, but that's the way this works. If you don't want to have me use your data anonymously, don't turn in your numbers to me. What we're going to vote on, normally in a process like this, you would find some way to pick the 6 attributes that we're going to choose among. We don't have time to do that today. So I picked 6 attributes off the list of a dozen that the ISPOR group said, these are the ones we're going to vote on, folks. These are listed in alphabetical order. And the one-page handout you have summarizes these attributes for you. So just take a moment to go through these. Altruism, fear of contagion, the health benefit is measured by QALYs, labor productivity, how much is it helping people return to work or stay productive at work, scientific spillover possibilities, might this invention create a new vaccine that will save lives somewhere else, and the value of hope, maybe this will give me some, even aside the expected value, there's some small probability hanging out there that will help. It's playing the lottery, okay? So those are the 6, yeah.
Is this intended to be a decision about our own care, or? Everybody's scared.
Yeah, it's, I guess, think about this, that's a good question, we should probably get some cohesion on that. Let's say you're thinking about things that are important for, let's say, a Kaiser Health Plan or the British National Health Service, so there's a societal perspective. Okay? Think about it as Kaiser or the British National Health Service or some logical equivalent to that, not just your single preferences, okay? Good question. And the truth is, I don't care how you score these things. So these are your preferences, and what you write down is correct. There's no correct answer. Everybody's correct answer is correct for yourself. So, and I'm not scoring you on those answers. I don't care what you write down. What I want you to do is use the ballot models, and then we're going to ask you how you thought about the ballots. That's what really matters to me today, all right? So, just to run quickly through these are sort of summaries of what comes out of the ISPOR report. Altruism means really care about what other people get, and particularly for people that are in poor circumstances, it's an altruistic idea. We'll subsidize Medicaid people with low incomes because we think that's a valuable thing. We're willing to pay for that, or more equal access. And so altruism and equity are wrapped into the first thing. We want society to be fairer about that, okay? The second one is fear of contagion. Think of Ebola and tuberculosis in an earlier era, or polio. And if that scares the heck out of you, that's an important attribute. And you think we ought to be concerned about that, then that one would get more weight. Ebola is a classic current example of this. Ebola policy of banning travel and confining people in Africa when they contract symptoms of the disease. That fear of contagion is driving the policy in this one. Health benefits, this is a core. How much health benefit are you getting out of it? It has to be in every model in my view. I think it should be fairly important, but you may differ in that. Labor productivity is slightly different. It means how much is this intervention going to improve people's health so that they can work or go to school, whether the work is in the household or in the home. So that's labor productivity. Scientific spillovers means somebody invents a new way to do vaccines using genetic reverse engineering, and all of a sudden that idea creates a whole bunch of new vaccines that they couldn't do before. That's scientific spillover that others can build upon. And then the value of hope, that hope hanging out there that this may cure me even though the expected improvement is not very large, all right? So those are the 6 attributes, and I'm going to ask you to tell me which of them is important using 6 different ballots, okay? So the first ballot is vote for one. Now, there's 2 ballots on each page. So vote for one is the way we run presidential elections in the United States. I want you to tell me the importance of these, but you tell me this by telling me which is the most important, and that's the only thing you get to tell me on this ballot. So on the first ballot, tell me which is the most important of these 6 attributes. All right? That should not take you long. Yes, Kai?
That's a more general question about with this method, and I don't have an answer, but like, is it possible that there's a scenario where there's a value to non-transparency, or because these are MCDA's explicitly stated preferences, and
Oh, yeah.
your preferences may be different, and you don't want to say.
Yeah, is there a value to non-transparency? Yes. You see that all the time. There's pharmaceutical companies and PBMs don't want anybody telling you what their price negotiation is. They value it. That may not be good for society, but it's good for them. Somebody usually wants somebody wants to hide data quite often. But from a societal point of view, I don't know very many circumstances where transparency is not a good thing unless it's military strategy and you're at war, and then you want to hide your strategy from your opponents.
I think Kai's coming to they would be more honest, perhaps. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So like,
Okay, well,
say
okay, so what I want here really, again, obviously sort of the question about strategic voting is another way you're asking about this. Is that your question basically?
No, like the examples like at an individual level, they might have certain actual preferences about the gender of the provider, but they're not willing to state it.
Okay,
So
what I want here is I want you to actually put your real preferences down.
Yeah, I'm talking about just a method.
Yeah. And I don't know who is who on this, so it doesn't matter. I'll never know what your preferences are, okay, unless you write your name on your ballot and turn it in. So, everyone done to vote for one ballot? Okay, so let's move on to the second ballot, which is on the bottom of that page. And this is approval voting. Now, approval voting is similar, but instead of getting to vote for just one, you get to tell me each of these 6 things that you approve of to being in the MCDA model. Okay? So you can vote for all of them, you can approve all of them or none of them or a subset of them as you wish. And then at the bottom, I want you to give me a quick 5-word summary. What does I approve mean to you? Because it's not defined. You look puzzled, Laura. Okay? So, check off each one of them you approve to be included in the MCDA model. That's what ballot number 2 is, all right?
Contingent on it being a societal perspective.
Yes, again, kind of a societal perspective. Think of you as representing, you know, what you'd really like to see if this is a societal decision-making process. That's so we all have that societal perspective, okay? Okay, all set on that? Let's move to ballot number 3. Ballot number 3 is rank order voting. This is something that probably a lot of you have done. There's a whole bunch of different ways to use rank order voting. If you're familiar with this, if you want to know how these would be used in the decision, we're going to use a board account. Number 1 on your list gets 5 points, number 2 on your list gets 4 points, number 3 on your list gets 3, and the last one gets 1 no points, and we're going to add up the points scored, and that'll be its board score, and that's how we're going to set the priorities. Okay? So the rank order voting, your task is just to provide me a rank order list, which one is the most important, second most important, and so on. And a little suggestion, if you're having trouble doing the rank ordering, pick the one that's most important to you and indicate it as number 1, and then find the one that's least important to you and write it as number 6, and then go back to 2, and then do number 5 and work towards the center. You may find that easier. But I want you to rank order the list of 6. Okay?
Can I ask a general question, not about the ballot specifically?
Sure.
And I think it might be kind of what Kai was getting at too, but how do you reconcile stated versus revealed preferences?
The question, how do you reconcile stated versus revealed preference? Part of the question involves what type of ballot you use, because there's a question about, they call in this literature they call sincere versus strategic voting, and in many cases there's an incentive to not reveal your true preferences, but vote strategically. I have to talk about that a little after we get through this exercise, because some of these voting methods are highly susceptible to strategic voting and others are more immune. None of them are totally immune.
But at least in the Fred Hutt study, there seems to be a good correlation.
I'm sorry?
The Fred Hutt study
Yeah.
seems to be a good correlation between what you expressed through MCDA
Yeah,
and what you actually...
right, and in some cases, there's no reason to hide your preferences. You know, an individual trying to choose a cancer therapy, there's no need for strategic voting. You have a very strong incentive to truthful revelation. When you're in a voting situation where there's you may want to really downgrade the one that you think is the nearest competitor to your favorite choice, for example. That would be a strategic voting.
Conflict of interest.
Yeah. Okay, so all finished with the rank order? Okay, so now we're going to move to the next ballot, which is called cumulative voting. Now you remember these MCDA things have weights that add up to 100. So what I want you to do on this one is to assign 100 points across the different choices. So you need to do a little arithmetic while you're doing this. Truth is, if you screw up and they add up to 95 points, I'm not going to shoot you. But I want you to assign 100 points across these different choices, and these will be the weights in a multi-criteria decision model. So this is called cumulative voting in the social choice literature. You have $100 to 100 poker chips to put on, and you can stack as many or as few you want, and I want you to assign 100 across all the choices. Okay, we all set on that? All right. Ballot number 5 is going to do something, this is like wine scores. When you go to the wine store and you see a score of 18 on a scale of 20, it's called range voting. So in this ballot, I want you to write down a score between 0 and 100 for each attribute. You're not allocating 100 points across all of them. It's 0 to 100 score you can put on each one of them. Okay? So you can score 100 on all of them, you can score 0 on all of them, or you can put different scores on each one of them. But I want you to score each one of them on a 0 to 100 scale.
Question.
Yeah, Rick?
Is there a reasonable argument to say that quality includes all of these attributes? Because in
No,
here,
quality doesn't include these attributes. Not yet.
the societal perspective is supposed to include all of these factors.
Right, but I'm saying that quality is you'd measure it in a measured health benefit.
In individual quality.
Yeah, but quality adjusted life years, but added up across the population. We're looking at population quality gains. But qualities do not include equity, for example. This is not utility,
You
it's,
can't prove it doesn't. I mean,
It's proven that it doesn't include productivity.
it's not necessarily true. I mean,
It is proven empirically that doesn't include productivity.
okay. Don't confuse my voters here. We'll argue about that later. Okay. So range voting, we go written down a score between 0 and 100 for everything, you all set? Okay, now I want you to do the last one, is a little different. And the last one is a new voting technique that's just materialized in 2010 from a couple of people in France, and it's called majority judgment. Now you're all familiar with this process. You're going to grade these things just like a professor grades students. And A means excellent, and this is your grade is its desirability for including in an MCDA model. So if you say it is excellent to include this, or B it's very good, C it's good, D is fair, E is poor, and F means it should not be in there at all. And if you want, you can put plus and minus on the letter grade, just like professor can put plus and minus on your letter grades on your transcript when you take health economics from Lou or whatever course you're thinking about. So how this is going to be assembled is a little tricky. Obviously, if the professor grades you, you know what your grade is. If we were going to assemble the grades of all of you, what happens is they look for the middlemost grade on every attribute, and it's the grade that can get a majority vote. And so you sort people out by the highest median grade, and then there's tie-breaking rules that if there's grades that are tied, there's tie-breaking rules. But basically this is find the grade that the majority would approve on, and you get the rank order out of that. That's how the scores are going to be produced out of the grades. That's a little different. But your task is to grade these. Okay? So there's 6 very different ways of inputting your preferences that could all be turned into weights in an MCDA model. So now, the scales of justice is kind of the way this works. How many people are standing on each side of the middle is the way that works. Going through that. Now what I want you to do is go to the gray sheet paper, and now I want you to tell me what you thought about each of these different ballots. Okay? So the first of them is how easy was it for you to use? And I want you to give me a score. A is very easy to use, B is easy, C is average, D is difficult, E is difficult to use. And I want you to give me a letter grade for each of the voting methods. Yeah?
Are the choices supposed to be mutually?
Can't hear you.
Are the choices supposed to be mutually exclusive?
I'm sorry, I just can't hear you at all.
Are the choices supposed to be mutually exclusive?
No, you can give the same grade. You can use the same letter grade for more than once. No, you could give an A to 3 of these and an E to 3 of them, or any grade you want. And you don't have to use all the letter grades. You can use each grade as many times or as few as you want, and you can give the same grade multiple times. Is that okay? That's different than rank ordering, where you can only use each rank once. You can give the same grade as many times or as few times as you want. Okay, so that's the ease of use. How easy was it for you to complete the ballot? So obviously I'm thinking about the human factors problem, which is going to get into how easy it is eventually to use MCDA. So, all set on that? So the next thing I want you to do is how enjoyable was it to use? Did you have fun or did you hate doing it? Just your instinctive, "Arr!" or yeah! Okay? So that, I just want to get your sort of intrinsic sense of joy about doing this. There's a story in the Washington Post after the last election, the midterm election in 2018, and they interviewed a bunch of non-voters and said, "Why didn't you vote?" And they had one woman they interviewed who said, "I don't vote because the method of voting, which is to vote for one person, does not allow me to express my rage and fury about the choices I've been given." That's not a very enjoyable voting process to that person. Now that's kind of what I want you. Okay, you all set on that? Okay, the next one is how expressive was the voting method? And that is to say, did you feel like you could really tell me what you were thinking, or were you limited in the vocabulary that you had available? So I now want you to tell me how expressive you thought each of these ballots was. A is very easy to express my feelings, B is easy, C is average, D is difficult to express myself, and E is very difficult to express myself. This will obviously factor into enjoyment, but I'm trying to capture expressibility as a unique feature. So I want you to grade each of these choices on how easy it is to express. Okay. All right, now the next one, we're going to turn to how much experience have you ever had with these type of a ballot before? And I suspect that almost none of you have encountered the majority judgment ballot, for example. So if that's the case, you would say very unfamiliar, no previous use. And if you've ever voted in a U.S. presidential or election or anything like that, you should be very familiar with voting for one, because that's how those work, just to put the extremes. And probably many of you use rank order, a few of you might have used approval voting. I'm just trying to get some sense of how familiar you are from your past experience with these different voting methods. Okay? So that's just a summary of your own experience. And the next to last one, ease of understanding. Can you understand how this ballot works? Now, obviously, you didn't have much time to learn how majority judgment is going to be used, so that won't be very easy for you to understand. And I've done this before, where I've spent an hour talking about each of the voting rules instead of talking about MCDA, so this may be hard for you to do, but just give me some answers if you can on this one.
We don't have that here.
Really?
Yeah.
We're
We have
missing a page?
experience, and then we have enthusiasm for use.
Okay, so we're missing ease of understanding.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, then don't do that one. That was hardest to do anyway. So the last one I want is enthusiasm. And this is a question, basically, if you are now heading off to your social club or church or synagogue that you are in, or you're in a faculty meeting trying to decide who the next person is you're going to offer a job to, any group where you might be voting, which of these methods, how enthusiastic would you be about recommending these voting methods based on the limited experience you've had? Which one of them would you, in some sense, most, or how much would you want to or not want to use each of these voting methods on a vote that mattered for you? And think about it as a club or a faculty meeting deciding something, or church or sailing club deciding what boats to buy in the fleet. Anything that matters to you as a vote, I want you to tell me how much you'd want to use each of these voting methods in something that mattered to you personally. Okay? You notice I didn't put in the presidential election because we can't change that. I want to think about this as something where you could actually have some impact on the voting method chosen. Okay? So, when you're done with all those, I'd like them all back, unless you don't want them in the data set, and then sit on them. I think we're out of time. I'm going to skip past these. talk about them later if you want. And say, let's move to questions, I'm all ears.
Questions?
We've had some
I
coming
can, I can start off with one question, is that, in my case voting, the rank ordering came out to be the top for many cases. But when I'm making an individual choice, it makes sense to me that I would use rank ordering, but we know the difficulties of aggregation with rank ordering,
Right.
right? And so, how do you trade off between the ease of use or the expression that individual feels for these voting methods versus what you need to do when you're making a population level decision?
Right. So this question Anirban asked basically, in choosing the voting method, these human factors matter, but there's also some certain technical problems that the social choice literature has converged on. And the rank order voting in particular, there's a whole bunch of different ways to assemble rank order information into a social choice. And they all, Ken Arrow proved this in his PhD dissertation in 1951. He had won a Nobel Prize for it. What did you do in your PhD dissertation? Did you win a Nobel Prize? So Ken actually proved that if you're using rank order input as the voting method, that there is no voting method in the world that can possibly satisfy 4 extremely simple criteria. One of them says if everybody likes choice A best, that choice A wins. That's the unanimity rule. The second rule says that if candidate, your preferences between choice A and B don't matter depending on whether candidate C is in the election or not. That's the independence of irrelevant alternatives. That turns out to be the real problem. Because when you're rank ordering, obviously, if somebody leaves the list, then some of the ranks change and the border scores change, for example. So rank order things all have this independence of irrelevant alternatives problem. Okay, the third rule is it always produces a winner. Now, some methods that are extremely simple in voting don't always produce a winner. Plurality voting, for example, always produces a winner. If you say we're each going to get to vote for one, the first type of a ballot we used, a plurality vote always produces a winner. But if you say the voting is majority rule, that doesn't always produce a winner. Okay? And the classic example of that occurs in the presidential elections in 2000. Bush won on a plurality voting rule in Florida and hence won the Electoral College. But that was because Ralph Nader took 4% of the votes away from Gore. And so if Nader had not been in the election, Gore would have won Florida and been the US president. So that's a perfect case of the independence of irrelevant alternatives problem. But it's also true if they'd insisted on majority rule in that, there would have been no winner because nobody got a majority of the vote. So that's the conundrum. And so the answer to your question, to me, and partly, it's a blend of how usable these are to people and what type of a decision you're trying to make. So I'm trying to learn how to help advise people on which of these voting rules to use, and you have to come to an understanding about, for example, is strategic voting a really big problem or not, because some of them are more or less susceptible to that strategic voting. So it's a complicated set, and there's no pure answer yet, but
Yeah.
that's my research paradigm for the next few years, okay?
Other questions?
Yes?
You mentioned the example of with a drug, you can't tell whether it works or not, and so you have to try these methods to see
Right.
if they quote-unquote work. What's your definition of whether it worked or not, or whether, I mean, obviously you're advocating for the usage of these mobile
Yeah,
attributes.
okay, so, a good question. Well, when would I think that I've shown that it works? Okay, well, I guess you've got to compare these always to what's the alternative. In clinical trials, you have to have an alternative therapy as comparison. And so I would say in Great Britain, for example, the choice right now is they're using cost effectiveness analysis. So if the British National Health Service and NICE started running a bunch of MCDA models, the first question I'd ask is, are they ever reaching a different conclusion? Okay? And if the answer is, no, they're always getting the same conclusion, then it's probably not worth the effort. Okay? If they're reaching different conclusions, then I'd sort of say, here's a list of conclusions that MCDA led you to, of choices, and here's a list that cost effectiveness led you to, and then I'd have people vote, which list do you like better?
hypothetical choice. I mean,
Well, no, not if you had the real British population voting on that. You could say, here's a list of things the British National Health Service is going to include next year in its scope of benefits. Here's what CEA recommends, and here what's MCDA. But British population vote. Instead of voting on Brexit, we're going to vote which list do you like better. That's not a hypothetical question. That's a real decision.
it's a choice, but you're voting on, I mean, you don't know the effect is one, so then you're making national policy, we'll use A versus B, say
Right.
cost effectiveness versus.
Well, yeah, and so
So you
then,
can track that over time.
sure, you could track
Society
it through
gets
time,
better.
and you could find out what was the effect on population health, but you'd also want to track the effect on how well these other things that you valued changed in the direction you wanted. So if you thought equity is important, you'd also want to have some measure about whether equity had improved because you spent some money on equity. So to track it down to see if it's really worked, you have to actually follow through and measure what actually happened on the things you consider valuable and then see if it happened
Right.
in response to the
Right.
interventions that you put in. In the back, yeah.
Karen?
Yeah, I got a question for a racing system. You mentioned that first, like when you choose different cars, different people have different preference, right? So when you kind of like measure, for example, health system or treatment, like we have payer system, we have payer perspective, government and individual, so many different perspectives. From your model, how to balance those weighting, and then how to apply into like big picture, like try to ask more audience to accept your model, because I feel like those weightings kind of key matter from your model.
Okay, could you summarize that for me, Antoine? My hearing is not quite perfect and I didn't quite
I
hear
think
it.
what Karen is saying is that different people have different preferences for the same things, and then this
Yeah.
MCDA kind of aggregates that, right? But in the healthcare system, you have different decision makers, right? You have payers, you have physicians, you have patients, and they might have different preference.
Yeah,
So
okay.
how do you aggregate it across
Okay,
a healthcare system?
different stakeholders in the system, and
Yeah.
how do you aggregate their preferences?
Right.
Yes.
Okay, really good question. Now I got it. Okay, so you absolutely caught on correctly that if you ask a bunch of doctors in a healthcare system what are their preferences, or you ask the patients enrolled in that healthcare system, or you ask the hospital administrator, or you ask the insurance company that's financing it, you're going to get different multi-attribute value structures, okay? So that's the curse and the benefit of this approach. Everybody has their own value model. But it's, and so in some sense, I can't tell you for sure if you're trying to, well, I actually can tell you who's the relevant decision maker. So if you're talking about the British National Health Service, the people and NICE are essentially the relevant decision makers. So whose preferences do they use? You'd like them to sample the population of Great Britain and somehow aggregate their preferences into what they choose to do. Which is why you need to worry about voting models, like I just asked you to do a little exercise on. And, but obviously you're going to get competing preferences. When you're talking about ways to control pharmaceutical prices, to draw an abrupt line, pharmaceutical manufacturers are going to have very different set of preferences than pharmacy benefit managers or insurance plans or consumers. Okay? And some of those will misunderstand the effect of profitability of pharmaceutical manufacturers on subsequent innovation. That's sort of the ultimate trade-off. If you squeeze profits, our standard argument goes, you'll squeeze innovation. So there's a trade-off involved in that. But there's no way to, in some sense, totally aggregate pharmaceutical manufacturers and pharmaceutical benefit managers and consumers. Unless you have an ultimate czar who's got a utility function that tells you how important these people are. Unfortunately, in our political system, that process works out by who can bribe the politicians. I'm sorry, who makes the greatest donations to the political process.
Yeah.
That's honestly the way our political system works now. It's a donation-based buying of preference in many ways now. And so that's in reality how it's going to come out in our modern society. That's not how you'd hope for it if you're an ethical philosopher, but there's no way to really make that combination well that I know of. Yeah.
Yeah, like what attributes have people been enthusiastic about as you've gone through? I mean, health benefits is a big one. But what are the other ones that people
Okay, yeah,
have been
that's a good question. What seems to really catch people's
Yeah.
attention? It values some, the one I really know about is vaccine priorities, because I spent a whole chunk of time on this Institute of Medicine project on that, and I've talked about that at 50 different symposia around the world, literally, in Europe and India and in Mexico and places like that, as well as all over the US and academic and so on. In vaccines, it turns out that there's a lot of concern that you probably could capture in a really carefully done cost-effectiveness analysis, but it's never done, and that is how well does the vaccine fit in with the local culture, and particularly in developing countries with the local vaccine schedule, because they don't have a doctor you run down the street to. Somebody comes in and give vaccines in the village every 3 months. And then the other one that really matters to them is the cold chain. Okay, and vaccines have to be stored in refrigerators or they're no good. And so you have to worry about the cold chain from the point of manufacturing to the point of the final injection. And if the cold chain is incomplete, even for 24 hours, because the power went down in the village, you're dead. Unless the vaccine is immune to the cold chain thing. So susceptibility to cold chain failure is a biggie to people worrying about vaccines in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, and it has almost no relevance at all in the United States, except in Rochester, New York, where the power goes out, and then it's not that the vaccine is going to get too warm, it's the vaccine's going to get too cold. It will freeze. And I lived for a week without power once in Rochester, and I know whereof I speak on this question. So the answer, those fit things mattered a lot. And something else we know from Ebola is that the thing that was really transmitting Ebola was burial customs. Nobody knew that when we started. But in fact, the burial customs in sub-Saharan Africa are to embrace the body of the dead person, which dramatically accelerated the spread of the disease. So the best treatment for that, the best intervention, somehow had to figure out how to preserve that social custom without having the physical contact. So that was really important. When you're talking about medical interventions in general, we know from the work that Laura and I and Scott Ramsey were doing on cancer therapy, the biggies are real obvious. Fighting by cancer, increasing my probability of survival. The next biggest one was a concern about long-term side effects. Then after that, we had a bunch of side effects listed in the model. Hair loss, probability of hair loss, nausea, fatigue, am I going to be able to continue working? And there actually, there was a big mix across the population in terms of how much it mattered. The first three on almost everybody's ranking were, the first two were basically how much is it going to cure me of cancer, and then long-term side effects turned out to be a big concern. But after that, some people cared a lot about hair loss. You wouldn't, obviously. Oh, it's already happened. And some people cared a lot about nausea, and vice versa. And so the answer there is what really matters to the individual patient is going to really matter a lot. And when Beth and her colleagues start doing this on amputation choices between a metatarsal versus a mid-leg amputation, there's going to be a lot of difference in what people worry about in mobility or the risk of having to do it or risk of infections and so on. They have different mortality rates, of course, which you don't want to worry about. So there's no clean, pure answer. The one everyone worries about in the published literature is equity. Oh, we've got to worry about the distribution of these benefits. And nobody actually talks about that except the Canadians that I've talked to who say, we really want to help the people that live in the Northern Territories, which means the native population, the Inuits and the Eskimos. They were a very high concern of the Canadian Health Department. Independent of almost anything else, they want to make sure they punch that ticket. So the answer is there's nothing universally common, even within the field of vaccines, because it matters, Sub-Saharan Africa is completely different than North America, for example.
Any last question?
Ask people.
Yeah. Any last question before we wrap it up? No? All right, then I would like to thank Professor Phelps for his great presentation.
token of appreciation from the Phelps Institute.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for coming in. We have a small reception at the back, so
Okay.
feel free to stick around and
Okay,
shuffle
and
around.
I do want your forms, please.
Yes, yes,
Pass them over this aisle and
data.
we'll collect them. And I will say, as one last parting shot, before I came here today, I thought choice was a way of grading beef.
Well, that too.
So thank you for your participation and enjoyed being here a lot.
The gray on the top.
Oh, they're all interspersed there, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, all together. That's okay. All right. This is yeah. Wonderful.
I could have room for these in my suitcase.
Yeah, we thought, we don't want to burden you with the big stuff.
Well, thank you. Actually, I'm not flying.